So before we really get started, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out today. We really appreciate it. This is our first, or not our first attempt, but um, this is our first attempt of an external professor coming and giving a virtual lecture. And so we are so excited, and we're actually pretty happy about the turnout as well. It's not a ton of people, but it's the few, the proud, the dedicated. Um, and we're so honored to have Dr. Tatlock speaking with us today. And just thank you everybody for coming.
Great. Well, it is a privilege, and some of you may not have heard the discussion Christy and I had earlier. This has been a long time in the works, trying to get things to come together for an opportunity. I guess I had reached out to the center probably over a year ago, and we were seeking to move things forward last spring, probably maybe in April or March. I think the presentation was maybe going to be in March. Before then, of course, the COVID situation changed the plans, and so at least this is a blessing to be able to do it virtually. And the topic is going to be very relevant, obviously, in terms of thinking about Good Friday. As far as my own work on the topic, it's been several years that I've been really digging deeply into the particular issue of human sacrifice in Christianity. Although of late, I haven't spent as much time in the research. About back in October of 20, see what year would have been, 2020 or 2019, I had a Lent book that came out, which basically tells a bit of my story connected to my own faith journey. So I have believed in the sacrifice of Jesus from a very young age, but then it was not until let's say since I became a professor here at what used to be Armstrong Atlantic State University or Armstrong State University, that I really devoted my attention to be able to look at the New Testament understanding of Jesus' sacrifice in an academic sense. But I took maybe, goodness, it could have been at least maybe 2 years, not full time, but just kind of chipping away and digging in and trying to understand for myself the representation of human sacrifice in terms of Jesus' sacrifice, as how the New Testament authors were representing this. There's ways in which we can view something, but sometimes we don't understand the totality of it. And even now, I don't claim to understand the totality of it. But you can really, as we'll see, there's several ways in which the New Testament authors represent the sacrifice of Jesus. Another issue, which we'll talk a little bit about, is this comparative focus. There are attempts to draw parallels from, say, the Greco-Roman world in interpreting Jesus. Nevertheless, the most significant emphasis, for sure, would be the ancient Israelite Jewish traditions. Of course, as Christianity grew out of ancient Judaism, that would have been the norm for them to draw upon what we would now call, say, the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible material. And they may not have been reading all of all of the texts themselves, some of which they maybe received, orally or knew of the stories, but they were, the authors are incorporating really a lot of things coming together. You could count, 8 or more different ways in which biblical authors are drawing in order to give a very complex representation of Jesus' sacrifice. And so even before we go very far, I would just ask you, yourselves, you don't have to communicate out loud unless somebody's in the room with you and you just want to share that regard. But just pause for a moment and think about, when you consider the sacrifice of Jesus, and, as maybe you already were, because today's Good Friday celebration of that. When you think about it, though, what are the main ideas that come to mind? And what are some of the key passages that might come to mind? And so what it will be showing today is looking at the complexity of it and hopefully giving you a fuller understanding of the way in which the New Testament represents Jesus' sacrifice. But I'll do a little bit of talk about, say, the Romans, not extensively, but that'll be one of the things I know Christy and I were talking a little bit about. And of course, from what I understand out at the center there, you are definitely interested in the Romans, and I assume you have your own Roman soldiers and reenactments going on there. So it's probably a particular interest in that regard. So we'll talk a little bit about that and crucifixion, but first I want to start with what is a quotation from a very well-known preacher known as Charles Spurgeon. And so when you look at this, I want to pause and consider how he is representing the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. He says here, what do we learn as we see Christ led forth? Do we not see here the truth of that which was set forth in shadow by the scapegoat? Did not the high priest bring the scapegoat and put both his hands upon its head, confessing the sins of the people, that those sins might be laid upon the goat? Then the goat was led away into the wilderness, and it carried away the sins of the people, so that if they were sought for, they could not be found. Now we see Jesus brought before the priests and rulers, who pronounce him guilty. God himself imputes our sins to him. So you can see at Spurgeon, he's looking at the way that Jesus is represented, and looking at, say, the last bit of his life. You can see reading in here the trial. He's brought before the priests and the rulers. They pronounce him guilty. And in his mind then, Spurgeon is drawing a connection to the Israelite tradition of a scapegoat. Now, literally, that is where, the notion of a scapegoat does derive out of, the ancient Middle East. You get it in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament tradition, the text there, that there is the scapegoat literally. So we'll come back to the Day of Atonement, which is what the scapegoat reflects. And so he is making this connection. However, the question is, do the New Testament authors make such a close connection to it? And there's at least one text which you could infer the scapegoat ritual behind it, lying behind it. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So there's one view here from Spurgeon. All right. Then another one, as I was driving, this is near where I live. This is maybe within the last 5 years. You see this outside Amazing Grace Church, Missionary Baptist. It says, in Exodus, he's called the Passover Lamb. So here you've got, just by looking at two different Christians' understandings, one is he's a scapegoat. Another one is that he's a Passover lamb. So is it an either or, a both and? Maybe you should say it's a both and more, and also added to that. So we'll look a little bit about Passover as well. Of course, that is very important given that we are right now, even, Jesus's sacrifice on Good Friday was part of Passover, ancient Passover. And so the correlation, the connection between Jesus being a Passover lamb is already embedded right there in going back to early Christianity. However, one thing that is complicated though is that the issue is, how does this reflect upon the idea of sin? So when it comes to the Passover lamb, it's not about sin sacrifice. However, when I asked you to think about Jesus's sacrifice, you may have been thinking about this idea that he died in a way that atoned for, or accounted for, cleansed, purified, brought about a change because of sin, right? And that's really at the core of Jesus's sacrificial death. However, you don't see that in Passover. So that's probably why the New Testament authors, it was a both and kind of idea in terms of thinking about, you have Passover, but then looking elsewhere to see where can we find other, let's say, Israelite rituals that are connected, that would give us a fuller understanding, and sin sacrifice is would be a key element that they'd be looking for. All right, so we'll come back to Passover as well. All right, so if you think about, here are some of the things we'll be talking about. Examples of sacrificial conceptualizations in early Christianity. The one, you may have thought of this already. Okay, Genesis 22, the firstborn sacrifice. Okay, that's not the only place firstborn sacrifice is brought forth in the Hebrew Bible, Jewish traditions, but this is the most famous one. That is, in terms of the Akedah, it's known as the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. On that note, having, let's say grown up as a Christian, a Christ follower, I probably didn't give a lot of thought to the Isaac relationship between Isaac and Jesus. And then when I was in grad school, I had a professor I worked under. He taught some classes. His name was Ralph Williams. He taught some classes like the Bible in English. He taught world religions, and he would do the Christianity section. And he made a claim that for Christianity, Jesus is represented as a type of Isaac. So, that was in grad school. Fast forward several years. Now I'm taking the time to really dig into the text myself. And lo and behold, I was surprised to find out that in the New Testament, there is really not much of an emphasis on the relationship, a correlation, seeing Isaac as a type of Christ. That the near sacrifice of Isaac, yes, it's there and you can see it. It's noted, for example, in a passage we'll be coming to. It is there, the relationship between Jesus and Isaac is brought forth. However, it's not as emphasized as I would have thought, based upon what, Ralph Williams had noted. So that was a surprise to me. The further I dug, as I dug into the text myself. So we'll look at firstborn sacrifice, and we'll talk a little bit about this binding of Isaac. We'll consider Passover, and we'll look at Passover. What does it, represent in the Jewish tradition? We'll consider, though, this idea of covenantal bloodletting. Right? In the Bible, it says really you cannot have a covenant without blood. And Jesus, as most, let's say, readily, we look at the collection of texts that we as Christians engage with, known as the New Testament or the New Covenant, right? And so this New Covenant is linked to blood. So, anyways, they'll draw on the book of Hebrews draws on covenant bloodletting. So that's another ritual that's brought forth to consider Jesus from a sacrificial standpoint. Then, of course, there's Yom Kippur or Day of Atonement. Some of you may know that that is the name of the Day of Atonement in Judaism, known as Yom Kippur, the most really significant day from the standpoint of seeking the forgiveness of sin. And it's still important up into the modern era. However, as you know, Judaism no longer has a temple. And so the place of sacrifice, Judaism has moved away from a sacrificial understanding of a practice, really, although some people would want to kind of continue it. And there's some, well, I don't want to go in, down that kind of into that rabbit hole, so to speak. But in any case, largely speaking, Judaism has moved away from the need for sacrifice. Of course, that's also paralleled in Christianity in the sense that Christianity sees Jesus' sacrifice as having been accomplished once and for all, and there's no need for any other animal sacrifice. So what you have is that two, really kind of trajectories move forward coming out of what we would call Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism would be the time frame. It would go back into, say, around the year 500 BC, but continue on until the days that the Romans are destroy the temple in AD 70. In that case, then that's right at kind of the heart of early Christianity. Before the temple is destroyed, and then of course Christianity continues in its early days after that. Right, the growth of the church was happening. The New Testament was being written, before and then after the day of the loss of the temple. But in any case, both faiths have moved forward without the need for that kind of sacrifice. All right, what about temple equipment? Well, there are at least two ways that temple furnishings or temple architecture are brought forth to talk about Jesus' sacrifice. And we'll come back to those later. And on one of those, when we talk about the Ark of the Covenant, that'll get us into looking at a comparative Jewish understanding from the Second Temple period, which has a very, very close correlation to the way that Jesus is represented in the New Testament. And that is from the book of 4th Maccabees. So we'll be coming to that one as well. Also, I should note, we'll have time for questions at the end. However, if anything is particularly pressing, please just unmute and let me know. Sometimes it's hard to see the chat if things are going on while you're lecturing with the PowerPoint, et cetera. So if you have anything that you're really pressing, feel free to interrupt me. I allow that definitely, even in my classes. So be released in that regard, and we can go back into some of the details if you want. All right, another element though is the suffering servant. Some of you may be familiar with that concept. The suffering servant is from the book of Isaiah, from chapter 52 to 53. And I'll share with you a very fascinating way that the suffering servant is represented in Judaism, even hundreds of years or so, somewhere around, let's say, 100 to 200 years before Jesus's ministry, as we'll come back to that. All right, and then lastly, and we'll see how we have time, is the topic. So you've got these various ways that Jesus is represented, and then this idea of emulation, that is that Christians are to mirror the sacrifice of Jesus, or even Paul went so far as to say that he is filling up the suffering, the afflictions, which are to kind of add to the affliction of Jesus, and that's in terms of spreading the gospel. His suffering, Paul's suffering, was seen as kind of a continuation. He himself was suffering for the sake of spreading the gospel. Anyway, so there's the idea of emulating, or Christians being like living sacrifices, which we can talk a little bit about at the end. All right, so let's start though with the Roman idea. Okay, so one thing we should pause and consider, and we're not going to go deeply into this, when you consider the idea of what constitutes human sacrifice, well, fundamentally, it's really, generally speaking, not so much about the mode of death, okay? And this would relate in terms of crucifixion. There are some procedures in human sacrifice in the broader kind of world history, let's say, which are that you could seek to fit into being more like a sacrifice. That kind of action is only done in, say, a sacrificial context. However, there are also so you could go that route and look for examples potentially, but you could also just see, though, sometimes there are actions which occur which could be used in a sacrificial context or a non-sacrificial context. A perfect example would be war. All right, warfare in certain interpretations can be conceived from the standpoint of a human sacrifice. However, the same type of warfare could also be considered non-sacrificially. So what is the difference between the two? Really, it's the interpretation, the intent, the goal. And what you may have, though, is that somebody views one action in a sacrificial light and somebody else does not. You could have a participant, for instance, in the case of Jesus, viewing his death in a sacrificial light, but there's not, really there'd be limited evidence to non-existent evidence to see that a Roman who was viewing it at that time would actually have viewed it in a sacrificial light. So what you could have is a normal type of execution and crucifixion, which crucifixion by itself is not sacrificial. However, it's the meaning attached to it, right, by Jesus, early followers, and up until the modern era, which give it its sacrificial significance. So you can have one act viewed in different ways. One's a sacrificial interpretation and one's not. That doesn't negate the sacrificial interpretation, right? The Romans themselves. So if we were to delve into it, we could have spent a whole lecture on looking at Roman human sacrifice. And so let's pause and just consider that a little bit. The Romans were open to the idea of human sacrifice. That is, to a certain extent. It definitely was part of Roman society, to the extent that 100 years before Jesus, the Romans had to outlaw human sacrifice. The Senate passed a law which outlawed human sacrifice. So therefore, that means that the Romans were familiar with human sacrifice. And in any case, an example of human sacrifice is gladiatorial affairs, at least in its early days. It's not certain that the Romans always viewed gladiatorial affairs from a sacrificial light, but the word for gladiatorial affairs actually goes back to this idea of munus, which means an offering. So gladiating in its early days, and it was connected to funerary practices, did have sacrificial. You could make a case that it had sacrificial connotations. So the gladiators, people fighting, connected to a funeral, it was a form of offering or sacrifice. And then, the tradition continues, and it grows into, this kind of massive event. And by the time, let's say people were performing gladiatorial affairs in like the Roman Colosseum, they did not necessarily still, let's say, significantly view it from a sacrificial light. So that's also an element of human sacrifice. That is, things can start out from a sacrificial standpoint, but the meaning can shift away from it. The society can move away from viewing certain practices from a sacrificial light. So and especially with the Romans, it's a very complicated affair that you dig into. They did have criminal execution, could be viewed in a sacrificial light. For example, they had, you may have heard of the Vestal Virgins in Rome. If a Vestal Virgin had no longer maintained her celibacy, she could be killed in such a manner that could be interpreted as in a sacrificial light. And so you could call that a type of criminal execution. Another example where you could make a case for criminal execution, that is, for instance, when the era when the Jewish temple was destroyed in 70, that time period, they captured somebody, one of the Jewish figures connected to the revolt. His name was Simon Bar Gioris, and he was brought back to Rome, and he was strangled there. And according to one view, it was connected to Rome, and they would come back and they'd have a big triumphal celebration. One view is that you could even interpret the killing of a captive in that case from a sacrificial light. However, when I've been working on my larger manuscript on Roman or on human sacrifice, and I'm dealing with the Romans, I basically noted that to date I have yet to find a clear sacrificial reference to Roman crucifixion in ancient sources outside of Christian writings. And then also there's one scholar named Cook. Cook, moreover, has worked extensively on the subject, but has not detected a Roman perspective that equated crucifixion to sacrifice. So this correlation between crucifixion and sacrifice is not clear. And so, and definitely in the New Testament, you do not get the interpretation that the Romans were viewing it in a sacrificial light. There is one Roman, though, who does express faith in the sense of, seeing that, what had transpired before him, he responds in faith. But he, did not necessarily view Jesus's death as in a sacrificial light. Maybe as he went and potentially met the disciples, and they could have then given him that type of sacrificial interpretation. All right, so the Romans then had the room to view things in a sacrificial light, but as far as crucifixion, it would be rather questionable to connect the dots. By the way, on a side note, they've found at least 2 skeletons in the Mediterranean realm which show signs of crucifixion. So rather limited in light of the potential numbers of people who would have been crucified. So in any case, if you're interested in some of this material, you can send me an email and we can chat a little bit more. All right, so let's think about a famous verse. All right, now let's get into Christian understandings more specifically. All right, so the most famous verse in Christianity is arguably John 3:16, right? And if somebody wants, feel free to unmute and let me know why would you think somebody at a sports event, like pictured on the screen here, I'm not even totally sure who is playing. It looks like the Orioles maybe and somebody else. Oh, it says Giants Tigers World Series. Okay, all right. So let me know why John 3:16 would be brought forth at a sports event. Why do you think it would be the verse?
It kind of relates to like the kind of core doctrine of Christianity, in my belief, on Jesus' sacrifice and on people's belief and faith connection towards salvation. So it kind of correlates all that into one in a nice verse, and it's easy for people to remember.
Oh, good point. And so it's a quick summary that covers the basics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it makes sense, right? Yeah, I mean, you'll see John 3:16 all over the place, you know? You'll see it maybe on the side of a semi truck, you know, as you're driving, or you might see it here at a sports event or something like that, right? It does a good job at really, these are the words of Jesus, at really summarizing. It doesn't go into great detail, but it summarizes the Christian message in a very quick way. So, you know, the standard view, right? Or a simple way of, we could translate it to the effect, you know, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life, right? What's interesting about that, though, is that you can actually view John 3:16 from a sacrificial light. And that is because the verb there, which is translated in English as give, uh, in the Greek, which is what the New Testament is written, Greek word to give can be viewed in a sacrificial light. Also, though, the Hebrew word, which to give, can also be interpreted in a sacrificial light. So another way of translating John 3:16 is to say, for God so loved the world that he, so the Father, God the Father, and so, you know, we won't get into, you know, the Trinitarian understanding in detail. Of course, you know, Christians, as we believe in the Trinitarian understanding of monotheism, that God exists as Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So in this case, though, is part of the Trinity giving another part of the Trinity, the Father giving the Son. But you could translate it by saying, you know, for God or the Father so loved the world that he sacrificially gave, all right, his only begotten Son. And an example, and when I go to the next slide, I'll show you an illustration from the Hebrew scriptures, which uses the verb to give in a way that is sacrificial. All right, so Micah 6:7. Micah 6, that chapter is very interesting. You're maybe more familiar with Micah 6:8, in which it says, you know, he has shown you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, but to do justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. You may be familiar with that. Well, if you look just before that, though, there's actually a couple of sacrificial references. All right, actually more than that. In the passage, Micah is writing, he is saying, you know, what does he need to bring pleasure, or to even bring about forgiveness of sin to the Lord, to Yahweh. And so in this verse it says, will the Lord or Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? And then notice this, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? This passage comes so close to saying, to this idea that somebody could die for somebody else's sins, right? It's saying a father is saying, shall I give or sacrificially give my firstborn for my sin, the father's sins, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? All right, so it comes so close. However, the verse I already quoted, the next verse says that's not what God requires. All right, so it's basically saying it brings it up in the realm of the possibility, but then it says that is what is not required in terms of this firstborn sacrifice. So this would not be like a direct correlation to, say, a New Testament understanding of Jesus as a sacrificial victim dying on behalf of other people. There's only one clear passage out of all the Israelite text, or at least that I've encountered, and I may have missed it. There's one other one that is kind of close, but the clearest, let's say, is the suffering servant narrative, when the idea is that the suffering servant in Isaiah was not being sacrificed because of his own sins, but on behalf of other people. And that's what we would call vicarious sacrifice, dying on behalf of other people. So Micah comes close to that. But then Isaiah 52 and 53 really focuses on that element, of course, and that's at the core of Christian belief, that Jesus was sinless but died on behalf of other people. All right, so there's something else, though, back to John 3:16. And it's in the form of an illusion, all right? Or you could see it you could infer from John 3:16. And this makes sense. I was I early on in my research, I didn't necessarily connect the dots, but I was convinced after a friend of mine was giving a sermon, Dave Algar, and connecting the dots between John 3:16 and Genesis 22. So John 3:16, another way of looking at it is that there's a parallel here between the Father sacrificing Jesus and Abraham at least nearly sacrificing Isaac. So let's take a look at what is for Judaism one of the most important and significant sacrificial narratives. I put it here as a famous narrative. What you're looking at is a mosaic from a synagogue in ancient Israel. And this one depicts, they chose to depict of all the various biblical scenes. And I'm not sure if they put anything else on here on this mosaic floor from the Bible. They have maybe like a calendar kind of zodiac representation on this. But anyways, they decided to bring this forth. All right, and this one you can see here, Isaac is on the right. Okay, he's nearly being burnt as a burnt sacrifice. All right, which in Israelite tradition was to be a full offering, an olah, it's called a burnt sacrifice. Then Abraham's next to him with this knife or kind of machete size. Then you'll see a hand, all right, to represent, here's connected to the intervention, all right. And it says here, right below the hand, it says, do not stretch out. Okay, do not stretch out. And then next to it, you see the ram caught in the thicket. And it says there, and behold the ram. All right. And then next to it, you see the servants. All right. In the narrative, you may note that Abraham goes with Isaac on top of Mount Moriah, and he leaves his servants with the donkey down below. All right. So in any case, so this is a very important text in Jewish tradition. But as I was telling you before, it's called the Akedah, which means that it's another way of saying the binding. All right. So why would they call it the binding? Well, they would call it the binding because Isaac is not killed. So if Isaac had been killed, it would have been, the sacrifice of Isaac. But instead, it's known as the binding of Isaac. Okay. So one thing that becomes important, though, is that as time develops in Jewish tradition, there's going to be a greater emphasis on the role of Isaac, okay, the agency of Isaac in this narrative. All right, now the text doesn't say how old he was. This image here depicts him as, relatively young. There's potentially even note of him, being older, adult. I've heard that interpretation, but in any case, all right. When you look at the narrative, though, and we may not, I've got it here on the screen, but we won't necessarily read it in detail. I'll go ahead and move on. Notice where it says in verse 8, okay, this is in response to Isaac's question. And you can imagine the scene. Abraham, he is going forth to sacrifice his son, had not told Isaac what was going on. Isaac is wondering, Dad, what's the story, Abba? Where's the animal sacrifice? They have the other elements. They have the fire. They have the knife. They have the wood. And yet what is going to be the victim? All right. And so Abraham, responds, and he's noted, if you want, read the book of Hebrews, how much great faith Abraham is noted for having, in which he's going to basically say here in verse 8, my son God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. So they go along, as it says, and then there's the near sacrifice of it, and then the ram is provided in its place. And that's where you get the famous phrase Jehovah Jireh, or Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide, in reference to that. So there are definitely parallels between Isaac's near sacrifice and the Father Jesus element. However, in the New Testament, the writers focus more on Abraham than they do Isaac, which is rather surprising. Okay, so they're not pushing the Isaac element. In contrast, Judaism, however, even going back into the Second Temple period, and I'll show you a text here in a moment, is going to emphasize the role of Isaac. So in Genesis 22, Isaac doesn't say much. He's like, what's going on, Dad? This is happening. Abraham binds him, puts him on the altar. It doesn't say if he's willing or not to participate in it. Like in verse 9, it basically talks about him being bound and laid him on the altar. So we don't know what Isaac's thinking in the narrative. Okay, it's kind of somewhat of a side note in comparison to Abraham. But nevertheless, as time develops, we're going to see a greater emphasis on Isaac. So you may have been following in the news. In March, they announced the discovery of more material of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Dead Sea Scrolls are really kind of a vast collection. They use the term broadly to refer to basically manuscripts or even fragments that are discovered in the area, the Dead Sea. All right, and they deal with different contexts. Some are biblical text, some are written in Hebrew, some are written in Aramaic. You may have seen in the news there was a collection from the prophetic work in the Hebrew Bible, but it was from Greek. Right, they found at least one fragment connected to that. So in any case, though, I want to look at what is known as 4Q225. All right, 4Q225. It's one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is found in Cave 4 at Qumran. So Qumran is the main place where you find, the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the main area, and that's where they would find, let's say, the scroll of Isaiah, which we'll be referring to later. But in this fragment, okay, 4Q225, and unfortunately it is fragmented because in this text, all right, it's not a biblical text. It's a kind of a Jewish book that is not included into the biblical text. But this one would date to this fragment would date to the time of Jesus. And in this text, and it's connected to a larger, you may be familiar with the Jubilees tradition, but in this text, it's talking about the near sacrifice of Isaac. And Isaac's going to speak differently than he does in Genesis 22. He's going to open his mouth, and he's going to make, at least we could say he utters the very first sound of it, because the text is fragmented and we don't know exactly what he fully says. The reconstruction, so it's got the first letter of what he says, but the reconstruction is that he basically is asking to be tied tightly. Okay, now where does that come from, this idea of being tied tightly? Well, if you fast forward, okay, so you've got this scroll, this fragment dates as basically the time of Jesus. It could go a little bit earlier, but it's basically the time of Jesus. Then you have the temple destroyed, all right? Then you fast forward hundreds of years, and at least as early as the 4th century, okay, so somewhere, around 1400 years ago. So this is hundreds of years after Jesus's ministry. There is in Jewish tradition, okay, this idea that Isaac is being asked to be tied tightly, okay, so that he does not ruin the sacrifice. Apparently, in order to have the sacrifice be proper, he was like, tie me tightly, Dad. So what this represents, that in later Judaism, there's this idea that Isaac is given an agency, that he wants to, do this well. And it shows, a level of willingness on his part. All right, so there's a greater emphasis on Isaac as time progresses. What this fragment shows is that already, and the reconstruction is a fair reconstruction, by saying tie me tightly, that's valid, because the first letter does relate to that phrase, which is found later. So that's an acceptable interpretation. What this is showing is that by basically in the days of Jesus, there were already those in Judaism who saw Isaac as, kind of having a greater role in his near sacrifice. Okay. And there's a lot, you could go really further in terms of the whole Akedah in Jewish tradition, and there's been a lot written about it. But that's kind of one element. So we can already see by Jesus's day that there's an interest in Isaac as being a willing participant. Okay, all right, but you don't see that emphasized in the New Testament. So that's one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll come back to another one. All right, so let's continue on in terms of Passover, and I just want to take a look at time. I was shooting for around an hour, and so I might need to pick up the pace. Although Christy had told me I could go longer in that regard. However, you don't necessarily want to hear me speaking all evening. But in any case, if you have questions, please let me know. All right, so let's go to Passover. All right, so here's a very famous statement. Okay, John the Baptist, he says, "Look or behold, the Lamb of God who lifts up or carries away the sin of the world." Okay, so you might be thinking, all right, the Lamb of God, Passover lamb, Jesus dies at Passover, the crucifixion's at Passover, you're connecting the dots. Okay. However, Passover, and it's pictured here, I have the privilege to see Passover performed with animal sacrifice, but not in mainstream Judaism. This is from a group on the right-hand side known as the Samaritans. And we don't necessarily have time, or we shouldn't take the time to go into that whole angle, but the Samaritans, they have continued to practice Judaism in their own way, although they're seen, you could call them more of a sect of Judaism, a minority movement in broader Judaism. On the right-hand side is pictured a man in the white hat, like a turban. He since passed away in like 2007, but that was their high priest. So they had a high priest, and I assume they've replaced him by now. High priest, animal sacrifice for Passover, and what is pictured on the screen is from the Passover. Okay, you can see a sheep being killed. So in any case, but what is Passover about? Well, some of you probably know that Passover is fundamentally, it's connected to the Exodus, right? But it's an act of substitution. And the New Testament definitely calls Jesus the Passover sacrifice. He's called our Passover, for instance. So he's referred to as the Lamb of Passover, for certainly. However, Passover sacrifice did not have anything to do with sin. It was connected to substitution. So therefore, for an early follower of Jesus, in their mind, they'd have to be thinking about more than just Passover. So Passover was part of it. So back to what John says, the Lamb of God who carries away the sin of the world. Well, I can't get into John the Baptist's mind in there. He may have been thinking of a different kind of a lamb, because you can use sheep in the sacrificial system of the Israelites. So John may not have been connecting the dots to Passover when he declares this. However, the idea of lifting up and carrying away sin is really what you see with the scapegoat ritual. All right, so it's possible that even in this statement, it's connecting Passover with the scapegoat, like we were seeing with Spurgeon's comment earlier. All right, but we'll talk a little bit more about Yom Kippur, or Day of Atonement, as we go forward. Another key element, okay? So one thing definitely is connected. So in John possibly connected the dots with the scapegoat. Definitely what you see connected to Passover is covenantal bloodletting. All right, so when you think about what Catholics would call the Eucharist, what you see in Protestant tradition known as communion, all right, the taking of the Last Supper, right? And this is an image of Da Vinci's representation. But what you've got here is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the first three Gospels, okay, they talk about the inauguration of Jesus's Last Supper, of starting a new ritual, okay? And you can read about it in Paul's writing as well. But the idea is that then Jesus converted over a Passover meal, right? His Last Supper was a Passover meal, and shifted the focus. Okay, so it's a new kind of liberation, versus an exodus out of Egypt for the ancient Israelites. This is an exodus for people out of sin, into kind of a new kingdom idea, a new type of promised land, you could say. But what you've got here is that Jesus is saying, here's the bread, okay, and so takes the unleavened bread and breaks it to represent his body, and then he says, here's the blood to represent, the wine, and remembered with wine or juice, however people want to, as his blood. And he says it's the blood of the new covenant. But one thing that's rather interesting, if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, it remembers Jesus is saying, it adds, or it has a fuller phrase of what Jesus says. Unlike in Mark and Luke, they do not list it out, but Matthew does. It remembers Jesus is saying that it was the blood for the forgiveness of sins. So Jesus already is connecting Passover to the forgiveness of sins, as you can see in Matthew 26. So if you look here, this is from Matthew 26, 26 through 28, right? As it says here, and as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. Verse 28 is the key one for our purposes at this point. For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins or the forgiveness of sins. So here you see Jesus connecting the forgiveness of sins, and Matthew remembers that, okay, unlike in the other Gospels in that regard. So it's Passover plus an element of what you could say basically like sin sacrifice. Okay. All right, so what about this idea of covenant bloodletting? All right, that covenants require blood. Well, if you're interested in reading about Jesus from a sacrificial standpoint, the book of Hebrews definitely hits it hard. All right, there's a significant emphasis there on Jesus and his sacrifice. All right, so Hebrews is a good book to delve into in that regard, and we'll make some reference to Hebrews, but not in great detail. What you can see here, though, is that it's going to refer. One of the things the book of Hebrew does is basically says that animal sacrifice is insufficient. That you needed to sacrifice animals year after year, like repeatedly. You had to keep offering animal sacrifice. In contrast, Jesus's sacrifice was once and for all, and we get that out of the book of Hebrews. Okay, so what you can see though, as you're reading, let's say for instance, if you skip down to verse 18, okay, it says, therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. All right, so it's talking about the Mosaic covenant. All right, there's different covenants in the Hebrew tradition. You can go back to Adam, you can go to Noah, all right, David, but the Mosaic covenant is really the key, and that's what is linked here in the book of Hebrews. But what about Jesus's blood? Well, go back up to 13 and 14. It says, for if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, okay, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh. All right, we can pause on that note. The idea of ashes, there is a connection between Jesus and purification, and like the ashes of a heifer. What they would do is they take these ashes, they could mix it like with water, and it was used for purification purposes. All right, and so there's a parallel connected to there, not necessarily in this text, but it says in verse 14, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So here you've got the emphasis of blood. All right, 15, and for this reason, he is the mediator, right? The go-between. So as Moses was the mediator for the first covenant, Jesus is the mediator for the new covenant, by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. All right, so you can see Hebrews is making a parallel between the situation with Moses and the situation with Jesus and the new covenant. So this really is like, you think about it, you've got the Old Testament books, or the Old Testament, and then the New Testament or covenant. All right, so there are actually, there are various ways in which the book of Hebrews talks about Jesus from a sacrificial standpoint. So let's continue on. We'll see a little bit more, potentially, at least you could if you read in Hebrews 10. Let's talk about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. What's depicted here on the right-hand side is a model of what Jerusalem looked like before the Romans had destroyed it. All right, so you had at the temple the idea that once a year, the high priest would go into the holiest place. A side note, for instance, that's why in modern Judaism, it's recommended or even outlawed by the rabbinic authority to not allow, they don't want Jews to go up onto the Temple Mount area today in case they transgress across, into the wrong place where the temple once stood. All right. But anyways, people who are Jewish are allowed up into the Temple Mount. And so in any case, there's like potentially a sign that limits that. But in any case, or tries to limit that. All right, so let's take a look at Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. All right, so it's a very complex process, so to speak. There's two ways in which sins are addressed according to the Day of Atonement. One was the scapegoat. We made reference to that earlier. All right, so there's actually two goats. Okay, one goat would be sacrificed, and its blood would be taken into the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple, right, where the divine presence was believed to be, where the divine presence was hovering over the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll talk about shortly. The other goat, though, which is what Spurgeon was talking about, the sins were placed upon the other goat. And then the sins were placed on it, and then it would carry the sins away from the community. Okay, so it was a ritual of removal. So on the one hand, yes, if John the Baptist is alluding to Jesus as a scapegoat, that would fit within John's statement. That's not outside the realm of the possible. So we could say that is potentially there. But even more explicit, though, would be what we'll see with the Apostle Paul is writing about Jesus and connecting him to the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll see in a little bit. All right. There's another thing, though, in the book of Hebrews, though, Jesus is explained, you may note, at the time of Jesus's death, right? The veil of the temple was torn into two, therefore representing that people could have free, well, it's not free, it cost Jesus his life, access, though. Through Jesus, access could be granted, you could say. Of course, when the Gospels are talking about the veil being torn, they didn't go into detail about Jesus being the means to get in there. When you look in the book of Hebrews, though, it talks about the idea that Jesus's body serves as the veil. So one must go through Jesus in order to enter into communion, close fellowship. And what's interesting, too, is that now, through Jesus, it opens it up. Whereas the high priest was only supposed to go once a year into the Holy of Holies. Through Jesus's sacrifice, believers in him are able to go through his body by means of his body and be in right fellowship, right relationship with God the Father in basically the heavenly representation of the temple. Right? So you could read a little bit more if you want to dig into that in terms of Leviticus 16 and Hebrews chapter 10. And we can loop back around to it if you're interested. Okay, so you can see here from Hebrews 10, though, let me just take 22 and 23. It says, "And let us draw near with true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled." So that's another reference to the idea of the Israelites would sprinkle blood, okay, so of an animal, sprinkled from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. All right, and that, purity was linked to, the heifer ashes, for instance. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And if you go up earlier, you can see the idea that, or even verse 20, that Jesus's flesh was the veil to get into meet with the Father. Okay, what about this idea of the temple equipment? All right, so not only then is the veil a representation of Jesus in the sense that his body is the veil in the heavenly context, okay, paralleling there of the temple in the heavens. However, there's also another element. They would take the blood, right, of the other goat, and they would place it on the mercy seat. Well, the Apostle Paul makes an interesting reference. It only appears once in all the New Testament. In Romans 3:25, it says basically, so Jesus is literally equated to the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. All right. Here is a translation from the New Revised Standard Version. It says, "Whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith." Now, wait a minute. What about this idea? Where's the Ark of the Covenant fit into that? All right. So the New Revised Standard Version had to give a little bit of a take some liberty in translation, right? Not in a bad way. Everyone who translates anything, you always have to find what is kind of at the heart of it if you want to truly represent it, right? So the New Revised Standard Version is interpreting where they say a sacrifice of atonement. Paul was literally saying the Greek word there I listed in parentheses, hilasterion. So another way of translating this would be, whom God put forward as a mercy seat by his blood. effected through faith. That'd be more of a literal translation. Now, let's pause and consider that. How could you get from a mercy seat to a sacrifice of atonement? Well, and I'm definitely not going to get into politics in this regard beyond just making a note. All right, we think about the White House, right? And the White House itself is a physical building, but it's also a symbol of something more figurative, right? The presidency. Okay, so one could say, let's say a press release comes out and it said, the White House said, okay, well, the physical building of the White House is not actually speaking, but this as a symbol of the presidency, it's speaking, let's say, on behalf of the president. Same kind of thing here. If you have something physical, just like the White House is physical, and you can view it symbolically, you have the physical mercy seat is the place where atonement was purchased or brought forth, let's say, okay? So the presence of God hovered there. And then you had the blood brought forth of the animal, and then there was an atonement occurring, all right? So then, since that's the place where atonement occurred, it's acceptable to view it as Jesus being not literally the mercy seat, but a sacrifice of atonement. All right. I hope that makes sense. If you want, we could talk a little bit more about it, but it's basically taking something physical and viewing it from a symbolic or more interpretive light. And that's where you get the New Revised Standard Version. Okay. But Paul was literally connecting the dots, Jesus being the mercy seat. Okay. The place by which atonement is achieved. Okay. Just like his physical body is seen as the veil, all right, by which people enter into the relationship or close proximity to the Father. Okay, well, what about this tradition in terms of looking at Second Temple Judaism? I already referred to this at the beginning of our time together. That is, we'll look at the book of Maccabees, 4th Maccabees. All right, so Maccabees, you maybe heard of Maccabees before. Connected to the festival of Hanukkah in Jewish tradition is this idea that there was a Jewish revolt against the Greeks, okay? And they end up cleansing the temple, and there's actually 4 books written about the Maccabees, okay? It was done in the face of religious intolerance. It was a revolt against intolerance by the overlords. They happened to be basically Greek / Middle Eastern rulers, known as the Seleucids. Well, in any case, in the Maccabean tradition, there are 9 martyrs, okay? There's a mother, her sons, and an older man, and they are martyrs, okay? So Judaism has a rich martyr tradition, the idea of somebody dying on behalf of faith. Well, you can see that not only in the book of 4th Maccabees, this idea of martyrdom, but what's interesting about the book of 4th Maccabees is that it makes the following statement in 1722. Again, the New Revised Standard Version. It says, and through the blood of those devout ones, talking about the martyrs, and their death, as an atoning sacrifice, divine providence preserved Israel that previously had been mistreated. All right, so where's the connection to what we were just talking about with Paul? The same word appears. So where the New Revised Standard Version says, as an atoning sacrifice, it's the same word, hilasterion. So what you have here in the Jewish tradition of 4th Maccabees is essentially the closest, all right, or one of the closest representations of human sacrifice outside of the New Testament that parallels the way that Jesus' sacrifice is understood in the New Testament, okay? So I'll say that again. Essentially, the closest parallel to the idea of Jesus' sacrifice outside of the New Testament, or even outside, like, say, standard biblical text, Old Testament, New Testament, is found in 4th Maccabees 17:22, or at least from the general area. I mean, you may be able to go farther afield and see, oh, okay, in this society, someone dies an atoning death. All right. And you can even make a case in Aztec human sacrifice, but at least from the same area. All right, you've got a very clear parallel. So when does the book of 4th Maccabees date? Well, it essentially dates to the same era as early Christianity. at least that's a view that's been brought forth, is that it is it's a first century book, okay, and even written before the temple was destroyed. So what you've got here is, as early Christianity is spreading the gospel and explaining Jesus' crucifixion as a sacrificial death, you have, at least in this tradition, a Jewish tradition of a similar type of action. All right. Well, it's possible that New Testament or the early church's understanding of Jesus' sacrifice could have influenced the book of 4th Maccabees. At the very least, there is a parallel to be noted between this martyr tradition and Jesus' sacrifice. Okay. So that's from a comparative light. I'm looking at the book of 4th Maccabees. It's an interesting one. All right. Let's consider another Dead Sea Scroll and looking at the suffering servant now. Okay. So Isaiah 52 to 53. For the sake of time, we're not going to read. We won't read all of this. I'd encourage you. I really enjoy, Isaiah. This section. It begins at the very end of chapter 22 and it goes into chapter 53, and it's beautiful representation of Jesus' sacrifice in a prophetic context of going earlier. But what you see here, what's particularly unique about it, is a very rare Hebrew Bible Old Testament text to the idea of somebody dying for other people's sins. And that's why you can call it a vicarious suffering. You can see here as it continues on a guilt sacrifice. In the text itself, it says basically that the suffering servant is a guilt sacrifice. Now, the suffering servant's been interpreted differently. It's seen as a symbol of Israel itself, but of course, in Christianity, Jesus is regarded as a suffering servant. You can see that beyond this one narrative. But if you take a look at the book of Acts 8, in the Acts 8 is when really there's a shift to bring in Gentiles, the spreading of the gospel into the Gentiles. And in Acts 8, after the Samaritans are receiving the gospel, it talks about Philip visiting the Ethiopian eunuch. The Ethiopian eunuch was on his way back to Ethiopia, and he had a scroll of Isaiah. And he's like riding in the chariot reading, which would have been a very costly and large scroll, and he's reading from this. And Philip is there and being led in, and Philip is going to, he asks him basically, do you understand what you're reading? And the eunuch's like, I can't unless someone explains. So then Philip, what he's going to do, if you look in the narrative, he's going to explain essentially that Jesus is the Isaiah figure that the eunuch was reading about, the suffering servant. All right, but there's more to the story, and this is something very interesting from the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right, and it might be even more complicated to talk about than the Hilasterion. So hold on to this. As Ralph Williams, that fellow I mentioned before, he would say, hold on to it both hands of your mind. All right, let's take a look here. All right, see at the very bottom of the screen, it says 1Q Isaiah, or it's a shortened version of Isaiah A. All right, so the best scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Isaiah scroll, this magnificent big scroll. All right, in the Isaiah tradition coming out of Qumran, where the Dead Sea, the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, are the most significant finds of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It takes verse 14 of chapter 52, and I will look at that verse with you. And it does something rather interesting. All right, so we're going to switch over and look at the verse, and then I want to explain to you how the Dead Sea Scroll represents it. Okay, so verse 14, that was Acts. Here's verse 14, Isaiah 52:14. It says, just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So he shall sprinkle many nations, etc. If you want to look at the offering for sin, the sin sacrifice, you go down to Isaiah 53:10. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief when you make his soul an offering for sin. That's a guilt sacrifice. And they would use a ram for a guilt sacrifice. And so that, even fits in with Jesus. But anyways, take a look at verse 14. Here's what's interesting. All right, it's very significant. And before I even go into 14 on this particular part, I will note, you may be familiar with the idea of what Messiah, all right, means. So Jesus Christ, we refer to him as such. It's Jesus the Messiah. Christ is a Greek version of the word Messiah. All right, the Messiah, a way of translating the word Messiah means anointed one. Fundamentally, by Jesus's time, let's say even if you look in the Roman period after Jesus's ministry, they were looking for somebody like who would fight against the Romans. There were two Roman revolts, and they each had a Messiah figure connected. And this goes back, say there was a revolt in the first century, there's a revolt in the second century. But in any case, the Messiah is fundamentally in line of someone to continue the Davidic covenant, to be a person who would rule over Israel. Okay, that's at its core. It means anointed one. All right. However, now there's also a priestly element that developed in Judaism as well, but the kingly is one of the most important ways that the Messiah was known, right? And we know that Jesus is represented. So Jesus had the bloodline of David, right? A royal figure. Even, at his crucifixion, he's declared to be the King of the Jews, right? So he has a royal pedigree. Well, so back to this issue, though, of the nature of Jesus's Messiah role, right? He is a suffering Messiah. And it was difficult, though, for his early followers to comprehend. If we were to go back and you dig in, you know the text where it says Jesus was asking his disciples near the area of Caesarea Philippi, if who do men say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, right? Well, if you look further, it goes on in that passage to talk about how Jesus is going to explain that he was going to be a suffering Messiah. All right. So that's how he fulfilled that role in that point of time, was to be one who suffered. All right. Well, this Dead Sea Scroll gives evidence, provided the interpretation is correct, and it's a fair and it's a good interpretation, that some people in Judaism, even over potentially within 100, 200 years before Jesus' day, already thought of the Messiah as a suffering figure. And how do we make such a conclusion? In the Isaiah scroll, Isaiah 52:14, where it's translated there, it says, so his visage was marred. The Dead Sea Scroll can be translated to mean he was anointed. So his visage was anointed more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. And that makes sense in verse 15. If somebody's anointed with oil, so he shall sprinkle many nations. You could even interpret it in that regard. So how is that a fair translation? Okay, now here's where it gets complicated. Okay, ancient Hebrew generally wrote without vowels. Okay, generally wrote without vowels. Okay, even in English, look at the word marred and take the vowels away from it. All right, and you would have MARRD, right? Well, you could translate it as marred, right? As there. You could even translate that as married, right? If you didn't have the vowels. So you can take something and we try to understand it, and based upon, you can reconstruct something from the context. Now, vowels were later added, and there were some ways they could indicate vowels in early on. But in any case, here's what the scribe does. The scribe adds one letter, okay, in the Dead Sea Scroll tradition to indicate that it should be translated as anointed. All right. So a better translation of it, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are our earliest biblical manuscripts. All right. So a better translation of verse 14 would be something to the effect of, so his visage was anointed more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Okay. Now, marred, that's not a problem to view it in a marred light. However, the point I'm making here is that it is an early evidence to indicate that some people saw the Messiah, the anointed one, as one who would suffer, and in this case, suffer a vicarious death. Okay. And so then this is from the Dead Sea Scroll, and you could say, that could reflect all the way back to the original, writing in the book of Isaiah, in the days of Isaiah, that Isaiah is prophesying that the anointed one, the Messiah, would die a sacrificial death for the sake of other people. All right. So that's a little bit one other element of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that gets us to the last topic. And I've gone just over an hour, and we won't go into great detail on this one. And that is the issue of emulation. All right. And so that basically some of you that I can assume in the New Testament, it talks about the idea that therefore Jesus's followers should live like him. And it's, Paul talks about being a living sacrifice. Jesus says those who want to be his disciples have to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow after him. Right? Paul even talks about the idea that he would be even rejoicing if he's poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of people's faith. Right? So there is this idea that Jesus was a role model that people then should give their lives in service, and the emphasis would be living, sacrifice, although there's the idea of martyrdom as well. But of course, the martyrdom is not interpreted as being, a saving sacrifice in that regard, okay? But a human should be a living sacrifice in line to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch off from the slide share so that I can, see people and we can open it up for questions. Okay, so let me know. Do you have any questions or anything that was you want to argue with or clarify? Maybe Scott's dog had a point of contention, a bone of contention with me.
You got your father-in-law on that one. He was laughing pretty good.
Oh, they're easy laughs though, because they love me. How about, was there anything that was particularly surprising that you wouldn't have thought from the standpoint of Jesus' sacrifice?
Do I have to refer to you as Dr. Tatlock, or do I have to, can I say Jason?
You please, Jason, yes.
It was interesting. There was in our live streaming that we did for the services today, and one of the songs they used, it happened to mention that the ashes are blessed. And to me at the time, I saw those lyrics in the part of the song, and I was like, I wonder what it means. And then of course the song carries on. But it's kind of stuck in my mind what was referring to the ashes. And as you've explained it, it's like, oh, that epiphany light kind of came on. It was like, oh, okay.
Oh, that's great. That's interesting. So maybe they drew from the book of Hebrews, thinking about like the ashes of the heifer. There's a reference, I didn't bring it up. I think it's Hebrews 13, which talks about the idea of Jesus being buried outside the gate, or his death being outside the gate, like is where they would take and burn like the heifer. So they may have been drawn from something like chapter 10 or 13. Interesting. I don't recall hearing that in a song, but there's definitely sacrifice brought forth in Christian choruses, etc.
The song was a song we hadn't heard before. It was called "The Suffering Servant," done by Mars Hills Music. And I've never heard the song, but what an appropriate song for Good Friday. It was so good.
I'll have to check that out. That's great. Yeah, sounds good. Thanks. See, that's why it's good to have your father-in-law and mother-in-law on Zoom when you're presenting. They might need to come to my classes for the rest of the semester.
I like the idea behind the atonement seat.
Mm-hmm.
The sacrificial, I guess. What was it? A goat or a lamb?
It was a goat. They would the high priest and maybe for his family, they would use something like a bull, but the rest of the people, the sins were addressed by a goat, and they would bring that in to the altar. Well, not the altar, to the mercy seat.
Was it a goat every time, or did they have like animals that were cheaper?
Oh,
Or
okay. So good point. All right. So what the Israelites had was in their system, they had the one time a year big event, the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. However, if people messed up throughout the year, they could do sin sacrifices. And one example of a sin sacrifice is the ram sacrifice connected to, and they may have used some other animals for it, but the guilt offering in Isaiah 53, when it talks about the suffering servant being a guilt offering, one of the ways they would do that was from somebody made a sin committed sin without knowing that they were wrong, and then they realized they were wrong, and then they could take a ram, and it could be done as a guilt offering. But that could be done like throughout the year.
yeah,
So they had different animals that they could use.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
I was trying to find within the now let me mute this thing because it's talking. Uh, uh,
Oh, you might have muted both.
I was just putting everything onto my headset so that it didn't talk out the TV.
Great.
Richard Rohr in his devotions this week was talking about Christ as a scapegoat, and I was trying to find that. It was kind of the focus of the whole week,
Ah,
and about how looking at that role as the scapegoat, that often people have used scapegoating in a human way to put things on other people,
yeah.
but also to look at all of Christ's life as a sacrament. And I was trying to find the reference in it, but yeah, it was this week within his daily meditations that it was kind of an interesting take on it.
That's good. One thing I would say is you can find allusions to it
Yeah.
as far as Jesus being a scapegoat, but I didn't find it, I would say, as explicit as you might have. Like Spurgeon makes it very explicit.
Yeah.
But things when the idea of somebody lifting up or maybe carrying sin, or even the idea of Jesus being the suffering servant. In that case, the references in Isaiah 53 do have almost like a scapegoat element to it, right? Carrying the burden, like the sins are placed on the figure. You could potentially read in that light. So in any case, though, the scapegoat is not like brought forth loudly in the New Testament as much
Sure.
as we might. Not saying it's not a good parallel, but it's just not as emphasized as we might expect.
And I think a lot of his point was not to try to make it a real strong parallel, but to worry that if we were to focus on scapegoating, we can use that in bad ways too.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, perhaps if you've got my email, you can send that along.
Yeah, I'll try to find it.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Well, that's good. Do we have any other questions? Comments?
I do. A quick question. This is Brenda. Thank you for all that you're teaching us tonight. It's a wonderful presentation so far. I can't wait to hear what else you're going to talk about. But have you actually been over on one of the digs over there, like the Qumran region, and for the scrolls and stuff?
No.
Or how many times have you been over there?
Well, the last time I was supposed to go, it was in the. I was supposed to go right at the outbreak of COVID, basically, or so in March. But that was for a ministry trip. But I have excavated a little bit, but not in the Qumran context. My friend actually, who's a scholar who teaches a professor out in California, if I recall correctly, he found a fragment in, say, one of the caves, which is interesting. but I haven't done that. And actually, my wife Krista even loved archaeological research even more than me. I almost became an archaeologist in this realm, but went more into kind of a literary analysis type study of ancient languages and stuff like that. How about you? Have you been over there?
No, not yet. Actually, I was supposed to go on my first trip, had everything paid for and everything about a year ago, and then COVID hit, and it was just supposed to be a tour, like a check it off my lifetime bucket list dream of things. But I got grounded a year ago, and kind of waiting to see like everybody else. I would love to go. It's just a matter of timing and of course expense and everything else doesn't just go on hold, so you can take a nice trip like that. You just gotta wait for the Lord's timing, but I hope to. It's definitely something I'd like to do.
I hope for you too, Brenda.
Thank you.
Life change. I sometimes tell the story.
I've heard so many good things about it.
Oh, what's that? Oh, good things, yeah. My father-in-law can tell the story. I remember visiting the area, the woman at the well, is in the Shechem area, was like the most dramatic experience he told me. And it was kind of like a side note. It wouldn't necessarily be the main thing you would go visit. But it just, you can see he's even tearing up, not in a good way, And it was just very impactful. I remember just from that one place. So I hope I do wish you well in working that out. May the Lord bless that.
Do you mind if I ask the name of your professor that does the digs in the caves?
Oh, yes. His name is Brian Schultz. He's done more archaeological work than I have. And this was a while ago when he did the excavation, but anyways, he's great. He'd be a good contact if you want, and I can help you in that regard. But yeah, he's fantastic.
Sweet. Yeah, I know a few guys over there that excavate too, so I was just wondering, I was like, do we have a mutual friend? Like, I was like, we might.
We could, if we
could.
I got a question. With the translations of the scrolls and stuff, how often do you come across words in modern translations that maybe are not as accurate as they should be?
Well, it is. It's the whole translation. Yeah, it's interesting. It's complicated. Sometimes, our manuscripts, it's hard to translate. Actually, Isaiah 53 is hard to translate. There's some parts of it that are difficult. And so, over the course, we don't have the original text, right? And so one of the ways that can help is if you compare. So what had happened was you had the original text written in like Hebrew and Aramaic, and then early on they were translated into Greek. Okay, it's known as the Septuagint. Some of you have maybe heard of that. And so one of the things that's interesting is that then you can look at the ancient Greek translation and examine that. And one of the things I found, actually, because I've been doing a lot of focus on the Psalms just for my own personal devotions, and in the book of Psalms, where it may say in Hebrew to hope, or trust, let's say, the Greek, they'll like to say hope instead, which is interesting. I mean, there are close concepts, trust and hope. So anyways, you can find some various ways of translating things, but translators have done an excellent job. Our modern translations are excellent, but they can draw both on the Hebrew and the Greek to try to give their best understanding. But there's definitely room for seeing things in a different light if you know the word and you look up. It could have a range of meanings, and so sometimes you could say, hey, I like this one better. This jumps out at me. I like rather translate it like this, instead of how a translator does it. And that's also good to compare other ones. There's one instance of a sacrificial text that just came to mind, that if you look in a lot of translations, it won't use the word sacrifice, but the literal Hebrew is sacrifice. And you'll see like the English Standard Version in this one passage in Kings will use the word sacrifice, unlike other ones may use the word to slay or kill, which still fits in. But anyways, I found the English Standard Version I've really kind of grown to like it more. They do a really good job. So if you're looking for kind of a potentially more, I don't know about literal. I know the New American Standard Bible is seen as a literal translation, but the English Standard does a good job.
English Standard does a good job.
I've got a question. I'd like to know what your thoughts are. You mentioned Spurgeon several times, and I love Spurgeon. Are you familiar with the Spurgeon Bible that Alistair Begg has put out with his ministry? Because it's got so much of commentary by Spurgeon. And what do you think of that translation?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, I don't know.
The name Spurgeon. I'm not sure if I've ever come across the Spurgeon Bible, but it sounds. Interesting. I mean, he wrote so much. Probably sermons that they drew on. But I'm not sure what the translation. Because they could have had the King James, the ESV. And by the way, I've come to a greater appreciation of the New King James version myself over the last, say, year or so. Somebody actually gave me a New King James version, and it's the version of it's the Spirit-filled Bible. I'm not the version. I'm the style commentary kind of is called the Spirit-filled, but the translation's the New King James, and they do a great job too. So a lot of good stuff out there. But the more we know about the ancient world, the better we can appreciate and sometimes give a more accurate understanding of how the ancient Hebrews would have thought of something.
Have you ever heard of Ben Witherington III?
No, tell me more.
He is a New Testament scholar. And just when you were talking about the more we know about the ancient world, he has this saying, something about, let me see if I can say it right. Text without context is proof texting or something to that effect. That, yeah, you've got to understand it, in the arena in which it was written, I guess you might say.
That's a good point, right? Instead of pulling it out of context, seeking to give it a meaning of our own devices, right? Yeah, it's always good to look at the context for sure. And part of that context is to understand the languages and the geography, as Brenda hopes to go see, and the places, etc.
Do you have any good sources on like Jewish thought, or like behind their customs, or behind I guess what you see in scripture you may not understand from an English perspective, but more of their customs, and is there any sources out there that can help parallel that?
I have not read much of it, but I would recommend at least looking into. They came out with, I think it may be called the Jewish, what's it called? Is it like the
Jewish Annotated Bible?
Bible? Oh, you've got that, Scott?
Yeah. Amy Jill Levine was the lead editor for that, and she's outstanding. She's a professor at Vanderbilt, and she is so it's, for just the New Testament, it's like 3 times the size, 4 times the size. You'll get a third of the page of text, and the rest of it is footnotes mapping back to various rabbinical discussions and traditional Jewish thought around things, and with an extra like 300 pages in the back of essays relating to first century Jewish thought and how it looked at this and how it looked at that. She also has written a ton of really good stuff. She did a book called, it just went out of my head. It was Short Stories by Jesus. And it's a look at the parables and about how a first century Jew would have heard those, being completely immersed as a Jew. She's a professor of New Testament and Jewish studies, and is practicing Jew, but is like they talked about the God-fearers in the Bible. She's very, very respectful and very in tune with Jesus' message. And she's done a number of studies, but the Short Stories by Jesus is a really accessible book. Amy Jill Levine. And yeah, I treated myself to a copy of her annotated New Testament as well.
Interesting. Interesting. Oh, thanks for sharing, Scott. You have a greater familiarity with it than I do. That's excellent. Sounds like a useful resource. One of the complications, though, that you can run into with the rabbinic tradition is that those sources can tend to be late by the time they were actually written down.
Right.
So,
And she
but-
talks about that too. Yeah.
So whether or not they actually reflect what, let's say, in the era of the New Testament, they actually felt like or thought is a little bit of a a jump. It's not necessarily that it would be wrong, but it's not necessarily as close of a course chronological or contextual
Right.
components that we might think. So we still need to be kind of careful, but it is helpful to see the broader thing. Like, the issue of Isaac that I was talking about. There's a little bit of evidence of it going back that Isaac had some agency, even to say the time of Jesus, in terms of his ministry. But you definitely see it more full blown in later tradition.
It's always helpful to me to think about the fact that, when we talk about, first century versus 4th or 5th century, well, that's like us writing about what did the Pilgrims think.
Good point.
Something that I found really helpful when I was studying ancient Jewish tradition in context of the New Testament is there's a messianic translation of the Bible out called the Tree of Life version. And it's not necessarily like groundbreaking. I don't really think, if I remember correctly, that there's any commentary or anything in there, but it takes the terms from the Old Testament that are used to describe things and it uses them in the New Testament as well. So like when you're reading about it, it says Jesus the Christ, it will say Jesus the Messiah. And so it takes those Old Testament terms and it's like, this is what it means in the New Testament because it's carrying it over, those Hebrew terms and things.
That's good. I wasn't familiar with that. That sounds good.
Yeah, I was gifted a copy by my professor when I was an undergrad. Apparently he knew one of the guys or something. And so he was gifted all these copies and he was like, you get a Bible and you get a Bible and you get a Bible. So all of his grad students got Bibles.
I've only gone a few times, but we have a Messianic congregation here in Savannah area, which it's great. It's cool to go visit.
It's so cool. Last time I went to a Messianic congregation, it's kind of like what I imagine heaven to be like. I was in Jerusalem and they had the words that we were singing to the songs on the screen in Hebrew and in English. No one's singing in the same language, but we're all singing the same song together. And I was like, this is really cool.
That's great. Does the center ever organize tours and take people over?
Not to Israel. Not right now. Maybe in the future, that's something we might get into. Right now, we mostly just organize tours of the museum, but hopefully one day, that's something we'll be able to do. I think that would be a blast.
Oh, yeah. That'd be fantastic.
I'm sorry, does James Fleming still do tours to Israel or not?
I'm not sure. He retired a couple of years ago. My understanding is that he was, but with COVID now and everything, I think they're pretty much grounded. So, yeah, I think everybody's kind of grounded, really. My understanding, because my professor has a dig coming up in Israel, and I'm trying to be able to go if possible. And right now, you either have to have all of your COVID vaccines or it's a 2-week quarantine in the country. And it's like, well, most people only plan to be there for 2 weeks. So by the time you're done quarantining, it's time to get back on the plane and go home.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Well, things will change. So
Yeah.
we'll see how things progress down the road.
Well, does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Tatlock? All right. Well, go ahead.
For some reason, I was thinking that you might actually talk about the actual crucifixion, but that wasn't necessarily the focus. So, but I appreciated learning some other things nonetheless. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, the crucifixion. There's a broader discussion of the actual, let's say the Roman practice of what you could call like suspension punishments. And I didn't get into it. There is some evidence that there was a conflation between the idea of crucifixion and this other type of practice, which was called the arbor and felix. And the arbor and felix was connected to a type of punishment that you could view in a sacrificial light. But in any case, it's kind of a complicated discussion. And I know even personally, like I haven't delved deeply into say medical representations of the crucifixion. But as I was noting, though, there are at least two examples of bodies of skeletal remains that have been found. One was published not that long ago, say 2018 or so when it came out, and this was found in Italy. The other skeleton was found in Israel, and that one's been known for probably decades by now. And they found in that particular case the nail in the heel area had still been lodged there and just left in the skeleton. So they didn't totally remove it. So, but there's only two that I know of, which is of who knows how many hundreds, thousands they actually crucified.
Don't we have a cast of that heel at the sitter? I thought I remembered it out in the garden.
We do. So we have one in a shadow box next to our Roman cross, and then we have another that is in the artifacts gallery. We have some ossuaries on loan right now from the Israel Antiquities Authority, and so we have it kind of set up, displayed in the ossuary because it was found in an ossuary. So yeah. And it was kind of weird that they found the nail still in, but they found it bent back. So it indicates it probably hit a knot in the tree and they couldn't get it out while he still had all of his soft tissue. So it was allowed to remain in the body. Because normally you would either remove those to reuse or actually a lot of times they were considered good luck charms for some reason in the 1st century. So people would actually collect them.
Wow. Interesting. I need to come visit your center one of these days, or I'd like to.
Yeah, you do. We would love to have you.
Well, it's not too far away. We'll just see how things go maybe down the road. That's I think about 2.5 hours or so, maybe.
Yeah, and there's lots of other stuff to do in the area too. So you could spend a day with us, go to historic homes. There's a water park down the road. So lots for your family to do if you decide to make a weekend of it.
That sounds good.
This might be kind of off topic, but you were commenting about making a trip to Israel. We had the fortunate experience when Jason and Krista lived in Israel for 2 years. We traveled over and spent a whole month with Jason and Krista. And it was just so impacting, changed how I view scripture. I'm a very contextual type person, visually especially, to be able to read something and then be able to put it into a visual context. It just brings it alive for me. That's kind of how my brain works. It was interesting on a secular radio station here in town, and it was on a travel show where they were talking about different travel experiences you could take. And they'd commented about various ones, but they said, and if you go to Israel, it'll change your life forever.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. I can say that's true for me when I went. Yeah. Well, are there any other questions for Dr. Tatlock? All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming. Dr. Tatlock, thank you so much for speaking. I'm so glad I finally got to hear your lecture now that it's been a year since we were hoping to have you the first time. So excited that we could actually finally organize this and get it to happen. And I just want to say, guys, thank you all so much for participating tonight. I thoroughly enjoyed your questions and your comments, and I had a blast. So thank you, guys.
Well, thank you. It was a privilege and an honor and a blessing to be here. Thank the Lord for the chance. And thank you for being a captive audience and paying attention. And it was a blessing. So maybe I'll see some of you out in LaGrange.
Yeah, well, we would love to have you guys, and hope y'all can all either, oh, Dr. Tatlock, tell us a little bit about your book really quick before we go. How can we check that out?
Oh, okay, so the book is called Reflections on the Sacrificial Death of Jesus Christ. And you can just find it through like Amazon. It was published by Whiff and Stock out of Oregon. And it's 40 days of study, particularly targeted for Lent, but you could read it at any point throughout the year. And it's basically it's like a daily devotional, but it takes the analysis that I performed on the New Testament, even before I opened up, generally speaking, before I opened up into looking at scholarship. It was more just, my own analysis, digging into it. So I share some of my own thoughts. I felt led to prepare that. When Christmas time, I felt the Lord leading to go in that direction. So I prepared it and got it going and had some people try to use it or whatnot. And so it's kind of several years in the making, but it's out. It's been out now for, I guess, over a year. And if you're interested, you can take a look at that, or even just look at Jason Tatlock on Amazon. You'll probably find it in that regard. But yeah, so it's more of what we were talking about, but also with more personal, kind of some struggles I've had and even faith journey as an academic. I talk a little bit about that, which it hasn't been the easiest, to be an academic and to, maintain faith. There was a time where it was very difficult, but, the Lord's blessed and I'm, the pendulum has swung in the other direction and back into the positive, so to speak. So in any case, thank you.
Well, thank you guys. And thank you all for coming and, maybe check out Dr. Tatlock's book. And we hope that you'll join us either for another virtual lecture or maybe even one day at the center. We would love to have Dr. Tatlock back and all of you. So,
A quick question.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know when the 7 IM's presentation might be ready?
It's actually going to be ready not the weekend of the 10th, but the next Friday after. So hold on, let me make sure I give you yes, of April.
Cool.
So we are finally going to try to get it up, also almost a year in the making. Our docent said she would be ready on April 16th. So it's something special that we're only going to be offering probably on Friday mornings in the beginning, just so that we can get more docents trained as well. And because right now the docent that is trained comes in only on Thursdays, Fridays, and then Tuesday afternoons. So, but yeah, new tour coming out.
Yeah.
7 IMs. So hope y'all can come check it out. And thank you all so much for coming. Happy Good Friday, or Blessed Good Friday. Happy Easter, happy Resurrection Sunday. And we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. Good night.
All right.